to establish a better understanding of where street photography has been, in order to later give us a better grasp on where it's going. I want to examine the book Bystander, A History of Street Photography by Colin Westerbeck and Joel Meyerowitz. This book is often referred to as the Bible of street photography, and for good reason, as it perfectly lays down the genesis of the genre and allows its readers to come away with many revelations about it. This is part one of a series intended to help broadly fill in the gap of historical context for the street genre. The goal is to do this in order to shed new light on this information both for myself and the viewers of this channel. This is The Complete History of Street Photography Part 1, Proto-Street Photography. This video is brought to you by Dehancer Film Emulation. To understand where street photography came from, you have to start with the streets themselves. Before cameras existed, the streets were already full of drama, movement, and life. People going about their days in ways that were often unpredictable, emotional, and worth seeing. Some of the greatest street photos ever made feel like lucky snapshots, but they come from something deeper, a long history of public life being interesting to watch. The book Bystander points to Paris as the place where street photography's roots really began. It connects Bresson's famous images to a city shaped by years of protest, uprisings, and change. Things that were already happening in Paris long before anyone was taking pictures. As Bystander puts it, public indiscretion continued into the 19th century. Even when civil disorder abated, people threw themselves into their social life with the same abandon with which they had entered into the violence. In the 1830s and 1840s, Paris went through multiple revolutions. People filled the streets, built barricades, and made their lives visible in a very real way. It was chaos, but it was also something you could watch. Writers like Charles Baudelaire picked up on this and came up with the idea of a flâneur, a person who just walked the city and took it all in. They didn't have a camera, but they were always looking. In a way, they were street photographers without film. In 1853, Baron Haussmann was given the job of rebuilding Paris. The city used to be a maze of dark alleyways, but many of those were torn down and replaced with long, wide boulevards. This completely changed how people moved, lived, and interacted in the city. Suddenly, more life happened outdoors. People walked more, sat at sidewalk cafes, and gathered in open spaces. And artists started paying attention. They began sketching and painting the scenes they saw outside, things that would later feel very familiar to anyone who loves street photography. Historian Norma Evanson explains it like this. In the years following Haussmann's renovations, the boulevard became the symbol of modern Paris. City life was essentially a public life, and the city was a stage on which the urban drama was played. All the variety and vitality of Paris, its social range, its material abundance, its sense of fashion, seemed to be visible in the streets. To artists, the boulevard was an abundantly stimulating subject. Probably no other city sat for its portrait as often as the French capital. Before cameras could easily freeze a moment in time, artists were the ones paying attention to what was happening on the streets. Writers like Victor Flâneur tried to capture the feeling of the street in his words. His 1858 book, What One Sees on the Streets of Paris, went on for hundreds of pages describing everything from street performers to quiet everyday habits. And some painters tried to do the same thing with their images. Constantin Guise, for example, sketched fast and tried not to be noticed, so he could catch people in natural moments. Baudelaire called him the painter of modern life, because he was so good at showing the movement and mood of the city scenes. And he wasn't the only one. Other painters all focused on real people doing real things. Domé in particular painted crowds and streetcars, street scenes, and city workers. His brush strokes were quick and loose, kind of like how a camera might blur a fast-moving moment. These artists weren't trying to make idealized portraits. They were trying to show how the city actually looked and felt. In doing so, they helped shape the way that we see city life today. And a lot of the things that show up in street photography today started to appear in Paris around the time. Buildings like the Eiffel Tower, Sacré-Cœur, and the Paris Opera became part of the city's image. Landmarks that would later show up again and again in street photos. But even the smaller details started to change. Storefront windows became more eye-catching. Posters and ads covered walls. Department stores became places where people went to see and be seen. The city was performing, and people were part of the performance. Colorful posters by various artists added new kinds of visual noise to the street, and people responded by looking, lingering, and reacting. It became normal to engage with your surroundings visually, like watching a show as you walked. Photographers like Eugène Auger would later walk these same streets and photograph all of this. The signs, the shops, the windows, the quiet corners. His work feels like a bridge between the world of painters and the world of modern street photography. By the late 1800s, the people, the buildings, and the street scenes had all started to act like they were ready to be framed. This video is brought to you by Dehancer Film Emulation, a plugin to help photographers and videographers achieve the look of film through digital means within the following software. For more information on how Dehancer can help you achieve the look of film on your frames by adding authentic and tested looks, compression, grain, halation, bloom, and more, check the link in the description. Further evolution of the genre began when William Henry Fox Talbot, one of the pioneers of the processes that went into the invention of photography, took to photographing cathedrals in 1843. He wanted to turn these photos into a photo book, believing that there was potential for the publishing of photos that fit into sequences. The first attempt failed, so he shifted his focus to create a book centered around his home. That book became known as The Pencil of Nature, which is regarded as the first widely published photo book. Talbot believed that a photo book couldn't be created from images made in the street, because he felt that subjects needed to be posed to create compelling sequences. He stated, "If we proceed to the city and attempt to take pictures of the moving multitude, we fail. For in a single fraction of a second they change their positions so much as to destroy the distinctness of the representation." This reflected a common belief at the time. Photography was seen as a tool for stillness, not movement. Exposure times were still long, sometimes several seconds or even minutes, so freezing life on the street seemed impossible. In that era, people had to hold completely still to be recorded clearly. Trying to capture something as chaotic and fluid as the busy street scene felt like a technical dead end. However, as these things go, an apprentice of Talbot's named Richard Jones immediately tested Talbot's assumptions by creating photos along with Talbot's cousin that convey the feeling of movement that actually adds to early images of the streets. Bystander points out, these first photographs were truly proto-images, pictures so basic that they made the enormous potential of the medium obvious right from the start. When we look at them today, part of the excitement that we feel is that we can see in them the infinite possibilities the future held for photography. These images are not crude, they're fundamental. The photos they created didn't clearly freeze action, but they hinted at it. In some of these early street views, you can see ghost-like figures, people who walk through the frame during long exposures. These mistakes actually ended up creating a strange and beautiful effect. They suggested motion. They made the street feel alive, even if the details were blurry. And several other figures from Talbot's circle began to nudge street photography towards what we know it as today. Another photographer who predated Eugene Auger by taking photos of a lot of the same subject matter had a growing infatuation with trying to solve the problem of freezing subjects in motion. He designed faster lenses and experimented with stereographs in an attempt to stop time. Although he wasn't totally successful, this did take him in the right direction. One of his most well-known photos, Chimney Sweeps Walking, was an early attempt to capture people mid-motion, which was still a rarity at the time. He wasn't just trying to document what something looked like, he wanted to capture what it felt like to see it moving. A lot of the photography from this era was aimed at influencing artists as sources of reference. It's why Talbot wanted to make his photo book about cathedrals in 1843. All of the developments that were taking place at the time caused painters and photographers alike to see the value in the new medium, because it had the potential to capture these spontaneous moments. Monet specifically was working with painting techniques that took him as close as possible to capturing a moment of fleeting light in a painting. But it was obvious that his attempts to stop time had come as close as they possibly could. Even if the technology wasn't completely dialed in to do so at the time, everyone could see the potential for the future of the medium. Once that was achieved, street photography could really take off, and so many in the art world were trying to solve this problem. Bystander summarizes this by stating, "The point is that street photography came into existence at a time when the issues that it addressed by its very nature were among the most crucial with which visual arts in general were concerned. No images are more rigorously bound to both the contemporary moment and the instantaneous vision than photographs are, and street photographs most of all. As a consequence, such pictures had a kind of presence, or what might even be thought of as a valence, that allowed them both to contribute to and to be influenced by some of the most important crucial developments of the period. Street photographs had in the earliest stages of photographic history a significance that reached beyond photography alone. From there, photography largely moved away from technologies that would make it more inconspicuous over the next several decades, shifting into wet plate photography, as photographers chose the sharpness this process could produce over its ease of use. To take these kind of photos, the glass plate had to be prepared just before the picture was taken, so that it could be placed in the camera wet, and then developed before it dried, as soon as the exposure was made. As a result of this process, photography became almost exclusively used for professional applications. But progress still occurred in the street genre, when one photographer named John Thompson published what is considered the first book dedicated entirely to street photography. Titled, street life in London. To create this work, Thompson had to pose as subjects due to the long exposure times required during this period. Although today, posing a subject or removing candidness from a moment is frowned upon by many street photographers, posing subjects for photos would have been more in line with the social norms of the day, and this method actually allowed Thompson to give a true representation of what life was like at the time, from that point of view anyway. Bystander also notes that the unease of many of the faces found in these photos would have been standard for how a lot of similar kinds of work looked at the time, stating, "The formal self-consciousness with which Thompson's subjects stood for portraits was common in the London photography of the day that dealt with ordinary life." A precedent had been set a quarter of a century earlier by Mayhew through his work London Labour and the London Poor. Thompson and his co-author Adolph Smith sought to identify their work with Mayhew's, which had been instrumental in the passage of the Second Reform Act of 1876. Stage scenes existed in a number of ways related to street photography at this time, where photographers attempted to recreate what they saw on the street in their studios. They argued that this had to be done because there was no way to properly capture what they saw at the time. But audiences didn't take to these kinds of images the same way that they took to Mayhew's, Thompson's, or others creating work in a similar vein. This tension between staged reality and direct observation would follow street photography for decades, raising questions about truth, manipulation, and how much control photographers should have over a scene. Thompson's work also allowed him to take steps in the direction that many street photographers carry on today, by traveling abroad to create work in other countries. He created the books Illustrations of China and Its People in 1873, and Through Cyprus with a Camera in 1878. At the time in China, the process of setting up street scenes in studios was common, and Thompson, along with a couple of other photographers, are cited as the only photographers to create work outside of the studio to display what China really looked like at the time, or at least as close to reality as they could. This approach, working directly in the streets of foreign countries, rather than recreating them in studios, was radical for the time. It introduced the idea that travel photography could be observational rather than theatrical, that it could document real people in real environments. It's a line of thinking that eventually shaped documentary photography, photojournalism, and the more immersive side of street photography. The inability to truly capture that reality is something photographers wanted to change from the beginning of the street genre. Because of how difficult it was to create images of subjects looking as they naturally would, especially when abroad. A photographer of the time named Samuel Bourne pointed this out in a quote reflecting on taking photos in India. Their idea of giving life to a picture was to stand bolt upright, their arms down stiff as pokers, their chins turned up as if they were standing to have their throats cut. Bystander also notes that this kind of pose is seen in photography created throughout the world during this period. The only instances where stiff poses didn't exist were in photos that were taken from a distance, that didn't interfere with scenes in any way, shape, or form. But as photographers started to adapt, that all started to change, when they really began to come to terms with the fact that they didn't have control of any of the subjects in their frames. Thompson's photo, titled Hookey Alf, from 1881, shows the evolution that took place from his work on the British Street Life series through the travels that he had in Asia. While in Asia, there were many instances where he had to improvise in terms of using a camera on a moving boat, exchanging common developers that weren't available to him at the time for lime juice and beer to complete his work, and putting his camera in relation to his subjects in different ways to get the job done and take the photo. Hookey Alf shows a scene that is much more alive. As Bystander puts it, the kind of effect that Hookey Alf courts literally crept into Thompson's street photography from the edges. It began in the hinterlands of the Empire, where British photographers sometimes had to give up both the control and the certainty they enjoyed at home. And it ended with a peripheral figure such as the little girl on the lower right in this picture, or the gawkers who had been allowed to intrude upon the frame in various other street life scenes. What we see on these bystanders' faces, as in a mirror, is Thompson's own unabashed curiosity about life staring back at him. This shift from total control to moments of unpredictability shows a photographer adapting to the limits of his environment and embracing the messiness of real life. The intrusion of bystanders into the frame, once seen as imperfection, became part of the story. In many ways, this is where modern street photography begins, with the photographer letting go of control, reacting to what unfolds, and welcoming chance into the frame. This signaled the beginning of a new visual language, one where the streets themselves became collaborators in the creative process. And while everything up to this point helped build the foundation, the next phase of street photography's history shows what happens when photographers fully embrace that unpredictability. And that will be the focus of part 2 of this series. Thanks to Hansen for sponsoring this video. Please like, share, comment, and subscribe. And until next time, keep developing.